discretion is advised.
What is the scariest short story you've ever read? Non-supernatural, if you please. That always breaks my immersion. Also, please try to post a link or the entire story. If it's short enough for everyone's reading enjoyment. Terror. Edit. I get it. Lone men and door knocking scare the pants off you guys. I said scariest short, not shortest scary. I heard one. A father is laying in bed after just waking up. He grabs the baby monitor and walks to his desk in his office at home. He has his baby on the baby monitor and hears his wife singing to her. He cracks a smile as he hears his wife go to sleep. Go to sleep. When suddenly the front door opens up and his wife comes in with groceries. Here's one that scared the living shit out of me when I was younger. A young boy is sleeping in his bed on a usual night. He hears footsteps outside his door and peeks out of his eyes to see what is happening. His door swings open quietly to reveal a murderer carrying the corpses of his parents. After silently propping them up on a chair, he writes something on the wall in the blood of the dead bodies. He then hides under the child's bed. The child is scared beyond belief. He can't read the writing on the wall and he knows the man is under his bed. Like any child, he pretends that he slept through the whole thing and hasn't awoken yet. He lays still as the bodies, quietly hearing the breathes from under his bed. An hour passes and his eyes are adjusting more and more to the darkness. He tries to make out the words, but it's a struggle. He gasps when he finally makes out the sentence, "I know you're awake." He feels something shift underneath his bed. I heard a good one a while back. Mommy told me never to go in the basement, but I wanted to see what was making that noise. It kind of sounded like a puppy, and I wanted to see the puppy. So I opened the basement door and tiptoed down a bit. I didn't see a puppy, and then mommy yanked me out of the basement and yelled at me. Mommy had never yelled at me before, and it made me sad and I cried. Then mommy told me never to go into the basement again, and she gave me a cookie. That made me feel better. So I didn't ask her why the boy in the basement was making noises like a puppy, or why he had no hands or feet. There is a short story in diary format about a young boy who is an immune carrier of a deadly disease that would be a pandemic if he were released from his hospital isolation. One day he wakes up and, discovering his kitchen emptied and nobody in the entire facility, he goes to his window to see that the town has been evacuated. He breaks out of his home and goes out into the world alone, leaving one last diary entry apologizing for leaving because he knows he's not supposed to, but he was really hungry and scared. I don't know what it's called, but I'm pretty sure it's by Stephen King. And while mentioning his work may be a cop-out, this story really did stick with me on a weird level. Probably not the scariest, but one of the first I read online. I can't find it now, but it was two friends who go to a cave and find a hole. They spend a lot of time trying to make the hole bigger and eventually get inside, and bad things happen. It was awesome and I wish I could find it and read it again. I can't find the link right now, but here is my regurgitated version. A little girl is upstairs in her room, playing with her dolls. She hears her mother call her down for lunch. She comes down the stairs and turns the corner, passing the pantry under the stairs. Suddenly the door swings open, grabs the little girl, pulls her in, and covers her mouth. Her mother whispered in her ear, "That wasn't me." Similar story. I've got more saved on my computer. When I was a child my family moved to a big old 2-floor house with big empty rooms and creaking floorboards. Both my parents worked, so I was often alone. When I came home from school, one early evening, when I came home the house was still dark. I called out, "Mum," and heard her sing-song voice say "Yeez" from upstairs. I called her again as I climbed the stairs to see which room she was in, and again got the same "Yeez" reply. We were decorating at the time, and I didn't know my way around the maze of rooms, but she was in one of the far ones, right down the hall. I felt uneasy, but I figured that was only natural, so I rushed forward to see my mum, knowing that her presence would calm my fears, as a mother's presence always does. Just as I reached for the handle of the door, To let myself into the room, I heard the front door downstairs open and my mother call, "Sweetie, are you home?" in a cheery voice. I jumped back, startled, and ran down the stairs to her. But as I glanced back from the top of the stairs, the door to the room slowly opened a crack. For a brief moment, I saw something strange in there, and I don't know what it was, but it was staring at me. Got another one. There was a hunter in the woods who, after a long day hunting, was in the middle of an immense forest. It was getting dark, and having lost his bearings, he decided to head in one direction until he was clear of the increasingly oppressive foliage. After what seemed like hours, he came across a cabin in a small clearing. Realizing how dark it had grown, he decided to see if he could stay there for the night. He approached and found the door ajar. Nobody was inside. The hunter flopped down on the single bed, deciding to explain himself to the owner in the morning. As he looked around, he was surprised to see the walls adorned by many portraits, all painted in incredible detail. Without exception, they appeared to be staring down at him, their features twisted into looks of hatred. Staring back, he grew increasingly uncomfortable. Making a concerted effort to ignore the many hateful faces, he turned to face the wall, and exhausted, he fell into a restless sleep. Face down in an unfamiliar bed, he turned, blinking in unexpected sunlight. Looking up, he discovered that the cabin had no portraits, only windows. Such is life in Moscow. Version 1. Night man tries escape from Gulag, makes his way to cabin in middle of tundra. Inside is plain, but many family pictures on walls. He falls asleep. In middle of night he is put in sack and dragged out. The next morning he is shot like dog. Pictures are windows. KGB always watching. A man goes to an old hotel. He gets his key from the reception and heads off to his room. As he walks down a hall to his room, he hears crying coming from behind one of the doors in the corridor. He stops at the door the crying is coming from and looks through the keyhole. A woman in black with wrinkled hands coved in liver spots and her face covered by a veil is sitting on a stool in the corner of the room sobbing. The man asks if she needs help. She doesn't answer. He asks again, and the reply continues to be nothing but crying. The man decides that he's too tired to help and continues to his room. The next morning, as he is walking down the same hall to go to reception, he remembers the old woman. He goes to her door and hears silence. He peeks through the keyhole and sees nothing but red. The man gives up and goes to the reception to check out. As he is leaving, he mentions the crying women in the room to the receptionist. The receptionist turns pale and says that that room is said to be haunted by an old woman. The man laughs it off and heads to the door. He is stopped in his tracks when the receptionist says the ghost is an old woman with red eyes. It's the hint of the supernatural, of the unknown and otherworldly, that makes things the most frightening. I'm not talking Sasquatch. I'm talking about that feeling you get when you're looking into that deepest, darkest corner of your bedroom just after the lights have gone out and it's dark outside, and you think you see something, only to notice out of the corner of your eye that your closet door is just barely open. Didn't you shut it completely? And you stare at it, and you stare at it, like it's a mother ducking weeping angel, until you remember that you haven't looked back at the corner in a while. A story on Reddit years ago. A woman survivalist and trained outdoors guide who loves to go solo camping returns home after 2 weeks of being in the bush and not seeing a single soul. Develops her disposable camera film to find a roll of film with numerous pictures of her sleeping at night. On different nights. She has never gone camping or hiking since. She told It Much Better. Darlan's Cadillac by Stephen King. The narrator, known only by his surname, Robinson, is a schoolteacher who lives in Las Vegas. He has become widowed after Darlan, a wealthy crime boss, has his wife murdered in order to prevent her from testifying against him. The murder remains unsolved, and Robinson, unskilled in the arts of revenge, has no recourse. Over a 7-year period, however, Robinson, mentally haunted by his wife's voice, devises a scheme of retaliation. Discovering that Darlan regularly takes the same route when traveling to Los Angeles in his Cadillac, Robinson decides to trick Darlan into taking a fake detour on which the Cadillac will crash into a ditch and be buried alive. He takes on a summer job with a road paving crew so that he can learn to operate the heavy equipment needed to excavate an oblong ditch just long and deep enough to contain the car, but not so wide as to allow escape through its doors. The trap works, and Alan is stuck in his Cadillac as it crashes into the pit. One of the bodyguards in the car with Darlan is killed in the crash. The other, crushed by the engine block, screams out of pain and panic, prompting Darlan to kill him. Robinson greets Darlan and announces his intent to bury him alive. Darlan addresses Robinson by name, prompting him to lean over the roof of the car as Darlan fires a few bullets skyward. He misses Robinson, who proceeds with the burial. Darlan, increasingly desperate, pleads with Robinson for his freedom, offering him a large sum of cash. Robinson merely tells him he will be released if he screams, gleefully listening to Darlan's cries as he completes the burial and paves over the car, with what must be the last gasp of air left to him. Darlan screams out, "For the love of God, Robinson," an allusion to the cask of Amontillado as the latter drops the last piece of paving into place. Robinson pays a relatively small price of undergoing much physical and mental exhaustion, but he feels satisfied that he has done a great service to the memory of his late wife, whose voice finally falls silent. This silence is something of a relief to Robinson. The press reports Darlan missing, joking that he is playing dominoes or shooting pool somewhere with Jimmy Hoffa. Robinson notes that every year, he travels along that highway to the area where he buried Darlan alive, and urinates on that spot. Sometimes he thinks he can hear Darlan laughing. Darlan began laughing insanely as he realized he was about to die, and it makes him Robinson smile. It's not as much scary as it is freaky, but I'll give you the synopsis of the story anyway. Spoiler: it's about a guy who hunts down his brother's killer to enact revenge. He kills the man who he knows killed his brother brutally. He then proceeds to bury the body, and on his way back home he sees a person walking, and begins to say that that man is the man who killed his brother. Through the narrative, it is revealed that the main character never had a brother who was killed, but simply believes every lone man walking around is his brother's killer. This means that our main character is actually a psychopathic killer. It's more of a George Orwell kind of scary than a horror story, but here goes. The Children's Story, by James Clavell. Over the course of 25 minutes in an American classroom following a war that America lost, new teacher begins to break down the patriotism and sense of right and wrong in the minds of the children, and then begins to mold them in the image of their benevolent occupiers. It's scary because it shows how tenuous the tighter children's parents can be when a state entity is ready, or worse, eager to take on the role of parent. It's scary because it shows how easy it can be to begin brainwashing young minds. It's scary because it begins with them reciting the Pledge of Allegiance without really understanding what it means. Something millions of American kids do every day. Hello, my dear, you do not know who I am, but I know you. I'm one of the 3 demons that were assigned to you at birth. You see, some people in this world are destined for greatness, destined to live happy, fulfilling lives. You, I'm afraid, are not one of those people, and it is our job to make sure of that. Who are we? Oh yes, of course. How rude of me. Allow me to introduce us. Shame is my younger brother, the demon on your left shoulder. Shame tells you that you're a freak, that those thoughts you have are not normal, that you will never fit in. Shame whispered into your ear when your mother found you playing with yourself as a child. Shame is the one who makes you hate yourself. Fear sits on your right shoulder. He is my older brother, as old as life itself. Fear fills every dark corner with monsters, turns every stranger on a dark street into a murderer. Fear stops you from telling your crush how you feel. He tells you it is better not to try than let people see you fail. Fear makes you build your own prison. Who am I, then? I'm the worst of your demons. But you see me as a friend. You turn to me when you have nothing else, because I live in your heart. I'm the one who forces you to endure, the one who prolongs your torment. Sincerely, Hope. I once read this scary story about a guy who goes to a haunted house that had 9 levels to it, and someone who made it through all of them got a prize. At first it's all hokey to the protagonist, but it continuously becomes more and more terrifying. I don't want to spoil it, in case someone knows what I'm talking about and decides to post it, but the ending literally made me jump. It has been reported that some victims of torture during the act would retreat into a fantasy world from which they could not wake up. In this catatonic state, the victim lived in a world just like their normal one, except they weren't being tortured. The only way that they realized they needed to wake up was a note they found in their fantasy world. It would tell them about their condition and tell them to wake up. Even then, it would often take months until they were ready to discard their fantasy world and please wake up. Oh, some episodes of the X-Files still creep me out. Some are the scariest because they have that perfect air of mystery and realism. I mean, it is still just a show. There is one episode about the Jersey Devil, or a kind of Bigfoot that lives outside of New Jersey, but it is more of a homo habilis looking person. One scene, a hobo hands Fox Mulder, the FBI agent, a drawing of the creature. I was about 10 when I first saw this, and it scared the shit out of me. I live in Washington, where Bigfoot is supposed to live. Also, another episode in Washington, where some loggers cut down some 200-plus-year-old tree that released some killer bug. Or one where they find a parasite in an ice core in Alaska. That show can be really creepy, especially to a 10-year-old. Last year on the SA forums there was a story about how a guy was driving through the mountains ex-army and came across a crash. The car wasn't damaged at all and almost deliberately placed in the middle of the road. He drove past and saw two people lying in the road. He pulls up in front of the crash and then looks back to see the people sat up and 20 or so eyes reflecting in his taillights from the surrounding bushes. He slams on the gas and goes. This story scares me because this kind of thing does happen with mountain tribes who are either cannibalistic or crazy. I will try and find a link to the thread. A man checks in at a hotel for the weekend and begins to take his belongings up to his room. The woman at the desk warns him though to stay away from the first room on the right on his floor. Of course, he doesn't understand why, but doesn't think much of it. Naturally, on his way to his room, he peeks through the keyhole. There's an old lady with her eyes closed looking at the wall. Creeped out, the man goes about his business. When he wakes up the next day, he decides to look again. This time it's completely red on the other side. The man assumes the guest just covered the keyhole with some paper and goes to the front desk. He asks the woman why he shouldn't get near that door, and she says there's a rumor a woman died there and that she now haunts the room. It's also said that she has glaring red eyes. A girl hiked the Appalachian Trail by herself and brought along a few disposable cameras. 3 months later, when she was finished, she got the cameras developed. Once every 5 or so photos from all over her trip was a picture of her sleeping. Story always terrifies me when I'm camping. The color out of space H.P. Lovecraft. It may have just been a one-time thing, but this story seriously freaked me out the night I read it. I've never been bothered by it like I was the first time. It wasn't scary in a sense that it made me turn on all the lights and lose sleep over, but it just made me feel empty. I found one a while ago. A woman lived alone with her dog, a large Doberman. One day, she came home and her dog was choking on something. She attempted to dislodge the object in his throat, but she couldn't. She rushed the dog to the vet, who said he would work on the dog and call her later. 2 hours later, the woman gets a call from the vet. Get out of the house. The police are on the way. They will explain, he says in a hurried voice. Afraid, she runs out of the house. When the police arrive, they charge into the house and run upstairs. She asks one of the men what is happening. The vet found what your dog was choking on. It was 3 human fingers. A few minutes later, the police escort a man out of her house. He was clutching his right hand because he was missing 3 fingers. There was a story on Anofles that I read a while ago that genuinely freaked me the duck out. Here's the abbreviated and slightly butchered version. There's this guy who moves back in with his parents for a few months to save up money. He has to sleep in a bedroom that is down in the basement. He feels this weird presence of some entity that keeps trying to get into his room all night. Every night, he senses this presence pacing the wall outside his room, like it's itching to get at him. As the days go by, the entity gets braver and starts coming into his room at night. Getting closer, he finally catches glimpses of it and describes it as a black human type figure squatting, walks on all fours, and it just paces, staring at him. Finally one night he decides it's time to man up and really see what this thing is. So he waits for it in his bed. He can feel it pacing, getting very close, staring at him. He opens his eyes, and squatting there before him is his mother, staring. The next morning she acts totally normal. It has been reported that some victims of torture during the act would retreat into a fantasy world from which they could not wake up. In this catatonic state, the victim lived in a world just like their normal one, except they weren't being tortured. The only way that they realized they needed to wake up was a note they found in their fantasy world. It would tell them about their condition and tell them to wake up. Even then, it would often take months until they were ready to discard their fantasy world and please wake up. Somewhat supernatural. A man wakes to find himself in an office building. He sees people walking outside, but cannot attract their attention. His phone rings from time to time. If he does not answer it, Golem-esque creatures enter the room and beat him. If he does answer, it's a garble of insect noises and shrieking on the line. He tries to escape, only to find that all doors lead to halls with locked doors, or other halls. He is given food in the form of stale donuts and cold coffee. Fearing suicide, he finally sees a woman with blonde hair who wants to escape. The golems come, but she runs while he is beaten. The next day, he receives his daily allotment of old donuts and coffee. The donuts have blonde hair in them. A little boy always told his mom he had a friend he would play with when he was lonely. One day the parents of the young boy went to dinner and a babysitter came for the night. The babysitter could not find the boy anywhere in the house. She went to look in the attic and the boy was playing with a midget who had been living in the attic for years. I avoid attics at almost all costs now. Click subscribe. If you enjoyed this video,